The diner went silent the moment his boot came down on her plate. Not because of the crash, not because of the food scattered across the linoleum floor, but because of what came after, the way the woman sitting there didn't flinch, didn't gasp, didn't pull back. She set down her coffee cup with the steadiness of someone who had heard far louder sounds than a ceramic plate shattering in far darker places than a late-night diner on the edge of Calvert City. 3 men, 1 woman in scrubs. Everyone in that room made the same assumption. Everyone in that room was wrong. If this story already has you gripped, subscribe to my channel, hit like, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go. The shift had run 14 hours. Mara Voss knew this not because she had checked her watch. Her watch had died sometime around hour 9, when she was elbow deep in a trauma case and had no business thinking about time anyway, but because her feet told her. Her feet always told her. The particular kind of ache that started in the heel and worked its way up the Achilles tendon and into the lower back was a 14-hour ache. She had cataloged enough of them to know the difference. She pushed through the staff exit of Hargrove Memorial Hospital into the November air, and the cold hit her face like a correction. The sky above Calvert City was the color of a bruise fading, that murky purple-gray that showed up after 10 p.m. when the neon from the strip businesses started competing with whatever light the clouds were willing to let through. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment and just breathed. Inside her bag, a set of keys, a dead phone, $17 in cash, and the remains of a protein bar she hadn't finished at lunch. Outside her bag, a 12-minute walk to her car, a radiator that had been making a sound she was choosing to ignore, and the low thrum of a city that never fully slept. She wasn't hungry, exactly. Hungry was too simple a word for what 14 hours of triage nursing produced. It was more like her body had issued a formal complaint and was now waiting for management to respond. She needed to sit somewhere that wasn't a hospital chair. She needed something hot that wasn't coffee from the break room, which tasted like regret and old plastic. And she needed 10 minutes where nobody required anything from her. Farrow's was 3 blocks off her route to the parking structure. She had passed it a dozen times without going in. A narrow diner wedged between a closed print shop and a laundromat, the kind of place that put its menu in the window and kept the lights low enough that you didn't notice the wear on the booths until you were already seated. A handwritten sign by the door said, "Open until 2 a.m. in marker that had bled at the edges." She went in. The place held maybe 12 tables. 7 were empty. A couple sat near the window, speaking quietly over coffee. 2 men in work boots occupied the counter stools, their backs to the room, focused on whatever the cook had slid in front of them. An older woman with a newspaper sat in the far corner, reading with the kind of concentrated stillness that said she came here regularly and had a usual. Behind the counter, a man in his late 50s worked the space between the register and the grill with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had been doing this for decades. Short, broad-shouldered, with a gray mustache and the kind of hands that looked like they'd fixed things, actual physical things, with tools, before they ever learned to cook. His name tag read Dove. He looked up when Mara came in, nodded once, and reached for a laminated menu. "Anywhere you want," he said. She took the booth closest to the back wall. Old habit. She didn't examine why she did it anymore. She simply did it, the same way she sat with her back to the wall in restaurants, the same way she tracked the exits when she walked into a room, the same way she clocked the body language of strangers before she clocked their faces. Some things stopped being choices a long time ago. She ordered the chicken soup and a side of bread because it was the simplest thing on the menu and because soup was the one food that felt genuinely restorative rather than just caloric. Dove brought it out inside 4 minutes, which she appreciated. She ate slowly. The soup was good, real stock, not the powder and water kind. And the bread was the dense, slightly chewy type that held up when you dipped it. The diner smelled like grease and coffee and something faintly sweet she couldn't identify. She let her shoulders drop from where they'd been sitting, somewhere around her ears, for most of the last 6 hours. She was halfway through the bowl when the door opened. She noticed them before she consciously processed why. 3 men, mid-20s to early 30s. The kind of entrance that took up more space than 3 bodies should. A physical expansion, shoulders wide, movement too deliberate, eyes doing a fast sweep of the room that wasn't curiosity, it was calculation. The one in front was taller than the other 2, wearing a dark jacket with something embroidered on the left chest that she couldn't read from this distance. He had a jaw like a block of wood, and the kind of smile that didn't reach anything above the mouth. The couple by the window went quiet. One of the countermen shifted slightly on his stool. The older woman with the newspaper didn't look up, but the page stopped turning. Dove came around from behind the counter, already moving toward the front, the way a man moves when he knows what's coming and has been through it enough times to have given up on acting surprised. "Pharaoh's is open to everyone," he said, and his voice was steady, but there was something compressed in it, something held down. The tall one, the one in front, looked at Dove with the particular expression of someone who finds someone else's attempt at dignity amusing. "We know it's open," he said. "We're the reason it stays open, old man. You remember that." The other two spread out slightly, not dramatically, not with any theatrical menace, just enough that anyone paying attention understood the geometry. One drifted toward the couple's table. The other moved along the counter. Mara put her spoon down. She did not do it loudly. She did not make any gesture that invited attention. She set the spoon in the bowl and folded her hands in her lap and watched, the way she had learned to watch, without appearing to watch, without the kind of focused stare that registers as a challenge, just a kind of ambient awareness that took everything in and processed it quietly behind a face that gave nothing back. "I'm going to need the envelope," the tall one said. I was still talking to Dove, but his voice had dropped into the particular register that men use when they want to remind you that the conversation has only one possible outcome. "Same as last month. And tell me you didn't make me come down here over a short count again." Dove said something too low for Mara to hear. The tall man's expression shifted slightly. Not anger, exactly, but something that preceded it. The kind of expression a person wears when they are deciding how much effort they want to spend making a point. "You have until I finish walking around this room," the tall man said. "After that, the conversation changes." He started walking, not toward Dove, around the tables. He moved with the casual ownership of someone touring his own property, stopping briefly at the couple's table, saying something that made the woman press herself back into her seat, then moving on. His man near the counter said something to the work boot men that Mara couldn't hear, but one of them put down his fork. The tall man reached her table. He stopped. He looked at her uniform, the pale blue scrubs, the hospital ID clipped to the breast pocket of her jacket, and he smiled the smile again. It was the kind of smile that was also a verdict. "You're eating alone," he said. "I am," Mara said. "Long day at the hospital?" "Yes." "You look tired." "I am." He seemed to find this entertaining. He pulled out the chair across from her, not asking, not waiting, and dropped into it, elbows on the table, and looked at her with that flat, measuring look that had probably worked on a lot of people. It was designed to make you feel exposed, examined, like you were being decided about by someone who held the deciding power. Mara looked back at him. She ate a piece of bread. "You know what I like about nurses?" he said. "You're trained to stay calm, even when you should be scared." "That's a useful trait," she said. He leaned forward slightly. "You're not scared." "No." "Why not?" She reached for her coffee cup, took a slow sip, and set it down. "Because I've been in rooms where I should have been scared," she said. "This isn't one of them." Something moved across his face. Not quite anger, not quite interest. A recalibration. He was used to people who either went rigid with fear or tried too hard to project toughness. She was doing neither, and it was throwing off whatever script he'd been running. He leaned back in the chair, and his voice shifted into something slower, more deliberate. "You're in the wrong room at the wrong time, nurse. You should probably be thinking about finishing that soup and leaving." "I will," she said, "when I'm done." He held her gaze for another moment, then stood. He moved back toward Dove, who was standing by the counter with both hands flat on the surface and an expression that had stopped hiding how much it was costing him to stand there and take this. "The envelope," the tall man said. "I'm done being patient." "I don't have it tonight," Dove said. "The week was slow. I told your guy on Tuesday. I don't want to hear about Tuesday. I can have it by Saturday. That's 3 days. I'm not trying to—" "The envelope," the man said again, and the word landed differently the third time. Harder, final. The second man, the one who drifted toward the couple, was now standing closer to the counter. The third was near Mara's side of the room, leaning against the wall beside the old jukebox that looked like it hadn't worked in years, picking at his thumbnail with the air of someone waiting for something they already knew was coming. Dove opened his mouth to say something else, and the tall man reached out and knocked the small condiment caddy off the counter. Salt shaker, pepper, hot sauce, toothpick dispenser. All of it went across the floor in a clatter that made the couple flinch and made the counterman nearest to the door stand up half an inch before deciding against it. Dove didn't move. "Now I'm going to take what I want from the register," the tall man said, "and we'll call the difference interest. And the next time I come in here and you don't have what you owe me, it won't be the condiments." He moved around the counter. Mara had been watching the third man, the one by the jukebox. He had pushed off the wall and was walking toward her table with the ambling, loose-limbed walk of someone who wanted to enjoy himself. He had something of an audience in mind. He stopped at her booth, looked down at her half-finished soup, and then looked at her. "You going to sit there the whole time?" he said. She looked up at him. "Because you're starting to bother me," he said. "Just sitting there like you don't care." "I'm eating," she said. "You were eating." He reached out and put his hand flat on the edge of her bowl and pushed. It didn't go over. It slid, caught the lip of the table, and a wash of soup went across the table's surface, dripping over the side, spreading onto the bench seat. He watched it happen with satisfaction. Mara set down her bread. She didn't say anything. "That's what I thought," he said. He looked over his shoulder, back at the other two, with the grin of someone who had just done something funny. "She's not going to do anything." He turned back around and held her gaze, and then he lifted his boot and brought it down on the plate that had held her bread, a flat, deliberate crunch of ceramic, and left his foot there, grinding, because that was the point. The humiliation. Not just taking, but making you watch it happen and doing nothing. The couple had stopped looking. The counterman was staring at the surface of the counter. The woman with the newspaper had set it down and was looking at her hands. "Clean that up," the man with the boot said to Mara. She looked at him. Not at his foot, not at the plate, at his face. "No," she said. The room changed slightly when she said it. Not dramatically, not the way it does in movies, with a gasp and a shift in lighting. Just a very small alteration in temperature, the way the air in a space changes when something real has entered it. The man's expression went through several quick stages. Amusement first, then irritation, then something that was trying to be authority. "What did you say to me?" "I said no," Mara said, "and I'd like you to move your foot off my plate." He stared at her. Then he smiled. A different smile than the tall ones, wider, less calculated, more genuinely ugly. "You think this is a situation where you get to make requests?" "I think that's my plate," she said, "and your foot is on it." He leaned down, both hands on the table, face closer than it should have been, and lowered his voice. "You're going to be very sorry you said that." Mara looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the way his weight was distributed, forward, both hands committed to the table, the foot still on the plate. She looked at the angle. She looked at the distance. She said, "You need to take a step back." He was still smiling when he straightened up and pulled his arm back. He was a big man and he moved fast, and in any other circumstance, with any other person, the next 30 seconds would have gone very differently. But his weight was all wrong. He telegraphed the wind-up by dropping his shoulder, and the follow-through was aimed at someone who was sitting still and looking scared, which she wasn't doing, which meant the angle was already off before his arm even reached its apex. Mara wasn't sitting still. She came out of the booth on the right side, away from the strike, and the fist passed close enough to her ear that she felt the air displacement. And then she had his wrist in her left hand, and she used his own forward momentum, stepped back and angled her hip, and he went into the booth seat face first, with a sound like someone dropping a bag of wet sand. It was over in less than 2 seconds. He was face down in the remains of the soup, making a sound somewhere between a grunt and confusion. And Mara was standing beside the table with her hands open, positioned, her weight already shifted to a stance that had been drilled into her body so thoroughly that it arrived before she consciously called it. The diner was absolutely silent. The tall man at the register turned around. The second man by the counter turned around. Mara looked at both of them. The man in the booth was getting his bearings, pushing himself up, and he turned with his eyes already full of something that had passed through embarrassment and arrived directly at fury. And he lunged. She sidestepped left, let his forward momentum carry him 2 full steps past her, caught the back of his collar with her right hand, redirected the angle, and brought him down onto his knees against the side of the jukebox. Not brutally, not viciously, precisely. Enough force to control, enough control to stop. "Don't," she said. He was breathing hard through his nose. His hands were on the floor. His knees were on the floor. His pride was somewhere in the vicinity of the broken plate. The tall man had moved away from the register. He was standing in the middle of the diner now, and his expression had moved through surprise and was doing something more complicated. Reassessment, calculation, the look of someone revising their working model of a situation in real time. "Hey," he said. His voice was different now, slower, careful. "We have a misunderstanding here." "We don't have a misunderstanding," Mara said. She was not loud. She was not performing anything for the room. She was just speaking. "You came in here to take money from that man by threatening him and his customers. That's what happened. We both know what that is." The tall man held up a hand, a gesture that was almost conciliatory, which made it more unsettling than the aggression had been. "I don't know who you are," he said, "but you should think about what you're doing right now." "I know exactly what I'm doing," Mara said. "You really don't," he said, and something in his voice said he was used to being right about that. The second man had moved, and she clocked it. Edge of her peripheral vision, the slight shift of weight, the way the hand was moving toward his jacket. Not fast. Trying not to look like it was happening. She turned her head slightly toward him and said very calmly, "That's a mistake." He stopped. She looked back at the tall man. "You want to know who I am?" she said. "That's a fair question, but right now what matters is that you're going to sit down and wait. And then you're going to answer for what you've been doing to this man, and this block for however long this has been going on. That's what's going to happen." The tall man looked at her for a long moment. Behind his eyes, something was running. She could see it, the fast interior calculation of someone trying to find the angle that still worked. His man on the floor was still on his knees. His other man had gone still. The register was behind him, open. "You're a nurse," he said. Like that settled something. "I'm a lot of things," Mara said. Dove had come around from behind the counter. He was holding a phone, and he was looking at Mara with the expression of a man who was still in the process of understanding what he was looking at, but had the sense to act while the acting was good. "I'm calling the police," Dove said, and his voice cracked slightly on the last word. Not fear, just the effort of saying something he'd wanted to say for a long time. The tall man's eyes moved to Dove, then back to Mara. She watched his body, not his eyes. The body tells you what it's going to do before the mind sends the order, and she had learned that in conditions where being wrong about it wasn't something you walked away from. He shifted his weight. She moved, not toward him, to her left, preemptively, a repositioning that said clearly, "I see what you're thinking, I've already accounted for it." And something in that, in the simple fact that she had moved before he moved, stopped him. He stood in the middle of that diner with one of his men on the floor and the other frozen by the counter, and the old man on the phone, and the woman in scrubs who had taken apart his structure in 30 seconds without raising her voice once, and the calculation behind his eyes slowly, visibly ran out of options. "You don't know what you just put into motion," he said. It was quiet. It was the quietest thing he had said all night, which made it the most serious. "Probably," Mara said. "But your guy on the floor has a choice. He can wait for the police on his knees, or he can sit down at the table. His call." The man on the floor looked up at her. His face was a particular mixture of humiliation and confusion. The face of a person who has not been on the receiving end of this before and is having to build an entirely new category for the experience. He got up slowly. He sat down at the table. He didn't look at anyone. The tall man looked at the door. Mara tracked the look, tracked the distance, tracked the angle between him and the exit, between him and the two men, between him and the possibility of just cutting and running and deciding this had never happened. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Dove was already talking to dispatch, giving the address in the careful, deliberate way of someone reading from a script they'd rehearsed without knowing they were rehearsing it. And the tall man heard every word, and whatever the exit calculation had been, it collapsed. Outside, 2 blocks away, someone was running a generator or a compressor, something industrial, rhythmic, indifferent. A car passed on the wet street. The couple by the window had pressed themselves into the corner of their booth, and were very still. And the older woman with the newspaper had not looked up from her hands, and the two countermen had turned back to their plates but were not eating. The tall man sat down at a table, not because he was told to, because he had looked at the woman in the pale blue scrubs standing in the middle of Pharaoh's diner at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, with her hands open and her weight balanced and her face revealing absolutely nothing, and he had understood for the first time in a very long time that he was not the most dangerous person in the room. And Mara Voss, who had not planned to be here, who had wanted soup and 10 minutes of silence and a chair that wasn't a hospital chair, stood in the center of that small, worn-out, grease-smelling space and listened to the sound of Dove's voice giving the address to someone who was already on the way, and felt nothing in particular. Not triumph, not adrenaline, not the performance of having done something remarkable. Just the particular, very quiet steadiness that had been with her since long before she ever put on scrubs. The soup was cold now. The bread was gone. Her feet still ached. She pulled out the remains of the table's undamaged chair and sat back down, and she waited because someone had to. And waiting was something she had always been very good at. And outside the rain had started, light and thin against the diner window. And inside, nobody moved, nobody spoke. And the only sound in Pharaoh's for the next 6 minutes was the distant, indifferent rhythm of the compressor 2 blocks away and the quiet drip of soup from the edge of the table she had not been asked to clean up. When the first unit arrived, its lights strobing red and blue through the rain-sheeted glass, the tall man, who had not moved and had not spoken, looked across the room at Mara one final time with something that was not quite an expression she had a name for. Not fear, not anger. Something older and less comfortable than either. She looked back. The door opened and the cold air came in with the officers, and Mara reached into her jacket pocket and found her hospital ID and set it on the table where anyone who needed to see it could. And she folded her hands, and she waited for the part where she would have to explain herself. She was used to that part. She was not, in fact, looking forward to it. Not because she was afraid of what they'd find, but because explaining herself had always been the most exhausting thing she did. In any room, in any context, in any life she had tried to build since the one before this one. But it would happen the way it always happened, and when it did, the things she had spent years keeping quietly in the dark were going to step into the light, whether she was ready for them or not. The first officer through the door was young, mid-20s, rainwater still beating on the shoulders of his jacket, hand already moving toward his belt before he'd fully scanned the room and understood there was nothing active to respond to. He stopped just inside the entrance and looked at the scene. One man seated at a booth table with soup on his shirt, another standing against the wall by the counter, and a third, the tall one, sitting at a table near the register with the specific stillness of someone who had decided that stillness was the only move left. Dove behind the counter, a couple pressed into the far corner, and Mara Voss in pale blue scrubs seated alone at her booth with a hospital ID on the table in front of her and her hands folded like she was waiting for a bus. The officer's eyes moved to her, then back to the room, then back to her. "Who called?" he said. "I did," Dove said. A second officer came in behind the first, older, heavier through the shoulders, with a sergeant's stripe and the kind of face that had stopped being surprised by things sometime in the previous decade. He took in the room in about 4 seconds and then looked at Mara. "You involved in this?" he said. "Yes," she said. "You hurt?" "No." He looked at the man with soup on his shirt. "Him?" "He tried to hit me," Mara said. "I redirected him into the booth. He has some bruising on his forearm, and probably his knees. Nothing requiring immediate medical attention, but I'd recommend an eval." The sergeant looked at her for a long moment. "You redirected him," he said. "Yes." "Into the booth?" "Yes." He turned to the first officer and said something low, and the younger man moved toward the 3 men and started talking to them in the clipped, practiced cadence of someone running a protocol, and the sergeant came over and sat down across from Mara in the chair the tall man had vacated, which still had the faint impression of someone who had expected to own the room and hadn't. "Sergeant Aldrich Farrow," he said. "And you are?" "Mara Voss. I'm an ER nurse at Hargrove Memorial. I came in after my shift." He looked at the ID she'd placed on the table, picked it up, read it, set it back down. "You were the one who restrained them?" "I stopped one from hitting me." The other two didn't engage physically. Dov Resnick called it in as an extortion attempt. That's accurate, Mara said. The one in the jacket, the tall one, came in requesting an envelope. Dov's exact response was that he didn't have it, that the week had been slow. The man knocked merchandise off the counter and told him he'd take what he wanted from the register instead. Then his associate approached me. Pharaoh was writing. His handwriting was small and precise in a way that didn't match the rest of him. You saw all this from your booth? Yes. Why didn't you leave when things escalated? Mara thought about the honest answer to that question for a moment. Because I don't leave when things escalate, she said. That's not how I'm built. Pharaoh looked up from the notepad. He had the look of a man who had interviewed a very large number of witnesses and was currently recalibrating which category this one fit into. He didn't pursue it. What followed was 45 minutes that Mara had experienced in various forms before. The collection of statements, the photographs of the broken plate, and the displaced condiment caddy, and the soup-covered booth, the names and contact information extracted from every person in the room. The couple provided theirs with the visible eagerness of people who wanted this documented and wanted to go home. The countermen provided theirs with the reluctance of people who lived in the neighborhood and were thinking about what came after the police left. The tall man, who turned out to have a name on his ID that read Garrett Solis, said very little during his interview. He sat with his arms crossed and his jaw set and answered the minimum required. And when Pharaoh asked him directly about the envelope, Solis said, "I don't know what you're talking about," with the flat confidence of someone who had said that sentence many times in similar rooms. The second man gave his name as Reuben Mast and developed sudden, severe problems with his memory regarding the evening's events. The third, the one with the soup on his shirt, the one who had put his boot through her plate, was named Corso Wyatt, and he said nothing at all. He sat with his forearm on the table and looked at a point approximately 2 feet in front of him and answered no questions. Mara watched them from across the room while giving her own statement, and she noticed things. The way Solis's eyes moved to the camera mounted in the upper corner of the diner, the way Mast kept his hands in his lap where they couldn't be seen, the way Wyatt periodically looked at her with the expression of someone trying to work out a problem that the available information wasn't resolving. Pharaoh thanked her at the end of it and gave her a card. He said she might be contacted for follow-up. She said she understood. She asked if she could go. He said yes. She picked up her hospital ID, pulled on her jacket, and went to the counter. Dov was standing there with a look on his face that she recognized. Not gratitude, exactly. Not yet. It was the look that came before gratitude, when the adrenaline was still too loud to let anything else through, and you were still processing the difference between what happened and what might have happened. "Your soup's cold," he said. "It was good soup," she said, even cold. He reached under the counter and pushed something toward her. A paper bag, folded at the top, warm. Bread in a container of the soup, for the road. She looked at the bag. She thought about saying she couldn't take it. She thought about the 14 hours and the protein bar she hadn't finished, and the radiator making the sound she was choosing to ignore. "Thank you," she said. She walked out into the rain. It rained for 3 days after that. Mara worked through all 3 of them, 2 back-to-back 12s, then a float shift that turned into a 14 when the afternoon nurse called out sick and administration couldn't cover the gap. Hargrove Memorial's emergency department ran at 92% capacity on a slow day and something in the neighborhood of unsustainable on a busy one. And the week of rain brought every category of seasonal misery: slip and falls, fender benders, respiratory cases, one cardiac event in the waiting room that required her to do compressions on a linoleum floor for 7 minutes before the team got the crash cart in position. She didn't think about Pharaoh's diner during any of this. There was no bandwidth for it. The work consumed the available space, as it always had, as she had chosen it to. On Thursday, she got a call from a number she didn't recognize. She let it go to voicemail, listened to it on her break. "This is Detective Lena Pruitt from Calvert City PD, Major Crimes. I'm following up on an incident at Pharaoh's on Tuesday evening. We have some questions about your background that would help with our investigation. If you could call me back at your earliest convenience." Mara listened to it twice. She sat with the phone in her hand in the break room with its bad coffee and its bulletin board covered in outdated memos, and she thought about what questions about your background meant when a detective in Major Crimes said it. She called back. Pruitt picked up on the second ring. "Detective Pruitt." Mara Voss, returning your call. A brief pause. The sound of someone shifting focus. Ms. Voss, thanks for calling. I wanted to ask you a few things about Tuesday night, if that's okay. Sure. The incident at Farrow's was captured on the diner's security camera. Sergeant Farrow's report noted that you physically restrained one of the men, Corso Wyatt, using what he described as advanced control techniques inconsistent with standard civilian self-defense. His words. Another pause. Can you walk me through your background? I worked as a trauma medic, Mara said, before nursing. Military? She could feel the shape of the conversation, where it was going, the particular corridor it opened into, and what was at the end of it. Yes, she said. Which branch? Army. How long? 8 years. And after? Transition to civilian nursing. I've been at Hargrove for 4 years. There was a longer pause this time, the sound of typing. The reason I'm asking, Pruitt said, is that we've connected Garrett Solis to an ongoing investigation. The men who came into Farrow's that night aren't just a local problem. We've been building a case for several months. What happened Tuesday? The camera footage, the witness statements, your physical intervention. It's become part of a larger picture. Mara let that sit for a moment. What does that mean for Dov Resnick? Dov is a protected witness as of yesterday, Pruitt said. He agreed to cooperate. He's been dealing with these men for almost 2 years. 2 years. Mara thought about the way Dov had moved when the men came in, the flat hands on the counter, the controlled voice, the particular efficiency of someone who had rehearsed their own survival. 2 years of that, in the space of a diner he had probably built from nothing. Is there anything else you need from me? Mara said. Not today, Pruitt said, but stay available. Things might move quickly. Things moved quickly. By Friday morning, she got a second-hand account from the nurse who did her shift handoff, a woman named Bet, who read the local news obsessively and narrated it to anyone within earshot during the morning change. They arrested 3 men connected to some kind of protection racket, Bet said, snapping her gum. 6 businesses on the east side, 2-year operation. The DA's office is calling it organized harassment, which isn't as exciting as organized crime, but apparently carries the same weight. The whole thing broke open because of some incident at a diner on Tuesday. Mara initialed the handoff sheet without comment. Were you there? Bet said. And she was looking at Mara with the expression of someone who had just connected 2 things. I heard a nurse was involved. It was on the overnight news. I had soup, Mara said. It was good soup. Bet opened her mouth. Mara walked away. But it didn't end there. That was the thing about things that broke open. They didn't break neatly. The edges were ragged, and they caught on what was nearby. What caught on Mara was the hospital. She didn't find out until Saturday, when she arrived for her shift and the charge nurse, a meticulous man named Theo Birkin, stopped her in the corridor outside the supply room with the expression of someone delivering a message he wished he could return. Dr. Pennick wants to see you before you start, Birkin said. Evelyn Pennick was the director of nursing services at Hargrove Memorial. She occupied an office on the 3rd floor that was aggressively organized. Everything aligned, nothing decorative except a single framed photograph on the desk that was always face down, which Mara had always found either very sad or very private, and had never decided which. Pennick herself was a precise woman in her early 60s, with the kind of posture that came from deciding a long time ago that posture communicated authority, and she sat behind her desk with both hands flat on its surface and watched Mara come in with an expression that was almost entirely unreadable. Sit down, Mara. Mara sat. I need to talk to you about Tuesday night. Okay? A news segment ran last night, a brief one. They didn't name you, but they described a Hargrove Memorial nurse involved in a physical altercation at a business on the east side. Our communications office got 3 calls this morning. Mara said nothing. I want to be very clear, Pennick said, that I'm not questioning the legality of what you did. From what I understand, what happened was you defended yourself, and you happened to stop a situation that had been ongoing for some time. I understand that. A brief pause. What I'm concerned about is the hospital's position. In what sense? Pennick's hands moved slightly on the desk surface, a small, controlled adjustment. We have a certain image to maintain. Our nurses are caregivers. They are perceived as compassionate, careful, non-confrontational. What's being described in the news, Mom, a nurse taking down multiple men in a diner, it creates a narrative that is, she searched for the word, complicated. Mara looked at her. She thought about 14-hour shifts. She thought about compressions on a linoleum floor for 7 minutes. She thought about Dov Resnick's hands flat on the counter, holding 2 years of patience together with nothing but will. With respect, Mara said, I'm not sure what narrative you'd prefer. Pennick's expression shifted slightly. I'm not asking you to have done something different. I'm telling you that we need to manage this carefully going forward. If media contacts the hospital about you, communications will handle it. If law enforcement contacts us regarding your employment, HR will be involved. And in the meantime, I'd like to ask you not to speak to press. I wasn't planning to, Mara said. Good. Pennick looked at her for another moment. You can start your shift. Mara stood. She was almost to the door when Pennick said, Mara. She turned. I looked at your file this morning. Pennick's voice had shifted. Not warmer, exactly, but different. More direct. You were a trauma medic. Yes. Army. Yes. You never mentioned it in 4 years. Nobody asked, Mara said. She went back to work. The shift was a hard one. Not chaotic, just relentlessly full. A pediatric asthma case that required an hour of close monitoring. A man who had fallen from scaffolding and arrived with 3 fractured ribs and a blood pressure that kept doing things it shouldn't. A teenager who had taken something she wasn't sure of at a party and needed 2 hours of observation and a very careful conversation. Mara moved through all of it the way she always moved, without drama, without flourish, with the kind of attention that didn't announce itself but was always entirely present. She was checking discharge paperwork on the scaffolding case at 5:45 when Burkhan appeared at her elbow. You have a visitor, he said, at the front desk. I'm in the middle of... I know, she said it's important. He paused. She showed a badge. Detective Pruitt was shorter than her voice had suggested, compact, somewhere in her mid-40s, with close-cropped hair and the kind of practical coat that said she spent a lot of time moving between buildings and weather. She was standing at the front desk with her hands in her pockets and looked up when Mara came through the doors. Sorry to come here, she said, and she actually sounded like she meant it. I tried to call. My phone's been in my locker, Mara said. What happened? Pruitt glanced at the desk clerk, then looked back at Mara. Is there somewhere? They found an empty family consultation room, beige walls, 2 low couches, a box of tissues on the end table that was always there in those rooms, in case. Pruitt sat on the edge of the couch and pulled out a tablet and turned it so Mara could see the screen. This ran online 2 hours ago, she said. It was a clip, 20 seconds, pulled from what looked like a social media account. Security footage from the diner, the angle from the upper corner camera, the timestamp in the bottom left corner reading 11:43 p.m. Tuesday. The quality was grainy, the way those cameras always were, but it was clear enough. You could see Mara come out of the booth. You could see the speed and the precision of what she did to Corso Wyatt. You could see the way she repositioned immediately and turned to face the other 2. Someone had pulled it and put it online, and in 2 hours it had been viewed 400,000 times. The caption read, Nurse at a diner. I have questions. Mara looked at the screen for a long moment. Then she looked at Pruitt. How bad? She said. It's not bad exactly, Pruitt said. It's everywhere. Local news picked it up an hour ago. 2 national outlets have already contacted the diner. Dov Resnick isn't talking to anyone. His lawyer told him not to. But the footage doesn't need narration. She paused. People are asking who you are. I know what comes next, Mara said. When people ask who I am. Pruitt looked at her carefully. There's something else. She swiped the tablet. A new screen. A case file, partially visible. Garrett Solis made a phone call from holding yesterday. His lawyer cleared the call, but we were monitoring. He didn't call family. He called someone outside the city. We don't know who yet, but we know it was long distance, and we know the conversation included your physical description. The room was quiet. The tissue box on the end table looked very white. He described you, Mara said. He described the nurse who stopped his guys, Pruitt said, which, with the footage now public, is the same thing. She closed the tablet case. I want to be straight with you. We're not sure what his outside contacts look like. Solis has been operating in this city for 2 years, but he's not from here, and we don't have a full picture of who he's connected to. What I know is that someone is now looking for you, and they have a physical description, and your name is one news cycle away from public." Mara sat with that for a moment. Outside the consultation room, through the thin wall, she could hear the ambient sound of the emergency department, the specific low-grade hum of a building managing urgency. "What do you need from me?" she said. "Right now, awareness. If anything feels off, anyone asking about you at the hospital, anyone following you, call me directly." Pruitt held out a card. "Not dispatch. Me." Mara took the card. "There's something I want to ask you," Pruitt said, "and you don't have to answer." Mara waited. "The footage," Pruitt said. "What you did. The technique, the positioning, the way you controlled the situation without escalating. That's not standard trauma medic training." She said it evenly, without accusation. "I've talked to people who know what that kind of training looks like. They were specific about what it isn't." The quiet in the room had a different texture now. "You're asking what I actually did in the army," Mara said. "I'm asking who you actually were," Pruitt said. "The tissue box, the beige walls, the low couch, and the hum through the thin wall." Mara had been careful, for a long time, about the distance between what she said and what she didn't. It wasn't deception, exactly. It was the particular discipline of someone who understood that some contexts required all of you, and some contexts required only the version of you that could function inside them. The emergency department required the nurse. It did not require, had never required, the other thing. But the footage was online. Solis had made a call. Pruitt was sitting across from her with a card in her hand and a question that was more than a question. "I need some time," Mara said, "before I answer that." Pruitt looked at her. Whatever she saw in Mara's face, it was enough. "Okay," she said, "but don't take too long." She stood. "The people looking for you aren't going to." She left. The door closed. Mara sat in the consultation room with the tissue box and the beige walls, and the question that Pruitt had put down on the couch between them, like something that had been waiting, for a very long time, for someone to finally pick it up. Her phone was still in her locker. The scaffolding case discharge papers were still on the desk. The teenager with the unknown substance had probably been cleared by now, and was back out in the world, which was a world that contained Garrett Solis making phone calls from holding and security footage of her going viral, and someone, somewhere outside the city, listening to a physical description and deciding what to do about it. She stood up. She smoothed the front of her scrubs. She went back to work. At 8:47 that evening, coming out of a supply run, Birkin stopped her again in the corridor. Same expression as the morning, but something added to it now, something tighter. "2 men at the front desk," he said quietly. "They asked for you by name. They said they're from the hospital's parent organization. They have Hargrove Group credentials. But I called administration, and administration says they didn't send anyone." Mara stood very still. "Where are they now?" she said. "Still at the desk," Birkin said. "The clerk is stalling them." Mara looked at the supply room door. She looked at the corridor. She looked at Birkin, who was a meticulous man and a good charge nurse, and who was currently doing something outside his job description because he had already, in the space of one day, figured out that something was wrong. "Go back to your station," she said. "Don't let them through the security doors. Call Pruitt." She remembered he didn't have the number. "Call Detective Pruitt at Calvert City PD Major Crimes. Tell her 2 men are at the front desk at Hargrove Memorial asking for Mara Voss with false credentials." "What are you going to do?" Birkin said. Mara looked at the corridor in both directions. "I'm going to go see what they want," she said. Birkin was already moving back toward the nursing station before she finished the sentence, and Mara went the other way. Not running, not hurrying in any way that would register as hurrying to the casual eye. Just walking with the purposeful stride of a nurse who had somewhere to be, which in this building was every nurse, every minute, so nobody looked twice. She took the long corridor around the back of the triage bay rather than the direct route to the front desk. It added 40 seconds but gave her an angle. She could see the desk from the eastern approach through the interior window that separated the waiting area from the administrative corridor, a strip of glass about 6 inches high running along the top of the partition wall. She stopped at the supply cart positioned near the east corridor entrance, picked up a clipboard that was sitting on top of it, and looked through the glass. Two men. One was standing at the desk, leaning on the counter with his forearms, talking to the clerk. Late 30s, medium build, wearing a gray jacket that looked intentionally unremarkable. The other was positioned about 4 feet back and to the left, not looking at the desk, not looking at the clerk. Looking at the room. Watching the doors. The one watching the doors was the one that mattered. Mara had spent enough time in environments where the ambient threat was real to recognize the geometry. You put your talker at the desk because the talker draws attention and creates a transaction that feels normal, and you put your watcher where they can see exits because the watcher's job isn't the desk, it's everything that happens away from the desk. It was a technique that worked in any building where you needed to locate someone who didn't know they were being located. She stepped back from the glass before the watcher could complete a sweep in her direction. She stood with the clipboard in her hand in the corridor and ran through what she had. Front desk compromised. They'd already given her name, which meant the clerk had confirmed she was on shift, which meant they knew she was in the building. The main exit was through the front, past the desk, past the two men. The ambulance bay in the back required a key card for the interior door, and she had one, but the bay itself was exposed, wide, lit, with multiple sightlines from the parking structure adjacent. The staff stairwell on the west end led to the parking garage on level 2, but the garage exit opened onto the north lot, which was the long way around to anything and left her in open ground. None of these were good. The other option was to not leave. She pulled out her phone and called Pruitt's number from memory. The detective picked up on the third ring. "They're here," Mara said. "Two of them. Front desk. False Hargrove Group credentials." She heard Pruitt move, the sound of someone standing up fast. "Are you somewhere safe?" "East corridor. I have sight on them through the partition glass." "Don't engage. I'm 8 minutes out. I've got a unit that can be there in 3. Send the unit to the parking structure on the north side. If these two bolt when they see your car, that's the exit they'll use. It's the only one with vehicle access that isn't directly visible from the front entrance." A half-second pause. "How do you know that?" "I've worked here 4 years," Mara said. "I know where the cameras are and where they aren't." "Okay." Pruitt's voice had shifted into a different register, the crisp, task-oriented mode of someone executing rather than assessing. "The unit goes to north parking. You stay put. Do not engage." "I heard you the first time," Mara said. She hung up and looked at the corridor. Staying put was the correct tactical decision. It was the decision that gave Pruitt time to arrive and gave the uniformed unit time to cover the exit and gave the situation the best possible chance of resolving without additional damage. Mara knew this. She held the clipboard and she stood in the east corridor and she breathed steadily and she did not move. The watcher at the front desk turned his head, not toward her, toward the ceiling, where a camera was mounted, the kind of cheap dome unit that most hospitals used, the kind with a visible LED that blinked when it was actively recording. He looked at the camera for about 3 seconds. Then he looked at the man at the desk and said something, and the man at the desk straightened up and took a step back from the counter. They were leaving. Not because they'd found her, because they'd found the camera. Mara moved. She went back through the triage bay fast now, using her badge to push through the security door and cut left toward the west stairwell. The ambulance bay was not going to work, but the stairwell connected to a loading corridor on the ground floor that the hospital used for linen and supply deliveries. And the loading corridor had a door to the exterior on the west side that opened into the alley between Hargrove and the parking structure. Not the north lot, the west alley, which was narrow and unlit, and where the camera coverage had a gap she had noticed a year ago during a delivery dispute and had never had a reason to mention. She went through the loading corridor at a controlled jog, through the delivery door, and out into the alley. The cold hit her in the face like it had on Tuesday night, with that same quality of correction. The alley was maybe 12 feet wide, dumpsters on the Hargrove side, blank concrete on the parking structure side, a single overhead light at the far end that barely reached the middle. She moved along the wall and stopped at the corner where the alley opened onto the street. She looked. The gray jacket was on the sidewalk, 30 feet to her left, moving in her direction. He hadn't seen her yet. I was looking at his phone, which meant the watcher inside had sent him something. A message, a direction, a last known position. He was walking with the steady pace of someone who had a location and was moving toward it. Mara pulled back around the corner. She pressed her back against the concrete and thought very fast. The phone call. The physical description Solis had given. The security footage with the camera timestamp. If these two had done any basic work, they had the timestamp, the camera angle, and the approximate direction from which she'd entered the diner. They had her hospital. They had her name from Pharaoh's police report, which was preliminary but not sealed. They had enough to build a target. The question was who they were building it for. She heard the footsteps on the sidewalk slow down. Stop. Then a voice, not directed at her, directed at a phone. She's not at the front. Camera picked up East Corridor 8 minutes ago. If she went out the west side, but yeah, I know. Check the structure. The footsteps started again, moving away from her corner, toward the parking structure entrance. She counted to 4, then moved back through the delivery door into the loading corridor, through the corridor, up the stairwell to the first floor, and stopped in the stairwell to call Pruitt again. There's one on foot on the west side heading to the parking structure, she said. I don't know where the second one is. The unit just arrived north lot, Pruitt said. Where are you? West stairwell. Stay there. We have a second unit ETA 2 minutes. Mara looked at the stairwell door. The small wire-reinforced window in the door showed the first-floor corridor. Empty, fluorescent, normal. She stood in the stairwell and she held the phone and she did not particularly feel afraid. What she felt was the specific kind of focus that arrived when the variables reduced down to the ones that actually mattered. Where the exits were. Where the people were. What she had that they didn't. What they had that she didn't. What they had was a network. A name outside the city that Solis had called. Resources she couldn't see. What she had was a building she knew and 8 minutes she'd already used well. The stairwell door opened. Not from the corridor side. From above. The second floor, footsteps on the stairs coming down. And she had about 2 seconds before whoever it was rounded the landing and saw her. She went down, not up, pushed through the loading corridor door and moved, and was 3 steps into the corridor when she heard the stairwell door above her open again, and then the fast, purposeful sound of someone moving through the same door she'd just come through. She did not look back. The loading corridor ended in a T. Right was the delivery area. A dead end with a roll-up door currently closed. Left was a maintenance corridor that connected to the boiler room, and beyond it, a second set of stairs that came up on the far east side of the building, near radiology. She went left. The maintenance corridor was warm, the air thick with the smell of pipe insulation and something metallic. The lights were fluorescent strips with caged covers, some of them flickering in the way that maintenance corridors always had flickering lights because they were on the bottom of every priority list. She moved through it at a pace that was as fast as she could go without making noise that would carry, and she could hear, somewhere behind her, footsteps. Uncertain footsteps. The kind made by someone who knew she had gone left but didn't know the layout. She reached the boiler room door, pushed through. The boiler room was large, warmer than the corridor, the 2 main units humming with the deep chest-level resonance of machinery doing serious work. Gauges, valves, pipe runs along the ceiling. A small utility desk in the corner with a clipboard exactly like the one she'd been carrying, which she still had in her hand, she realized, because she hadn't put it down. She stopped beside the near boiler unit and listened. The corridor footsteps had slowed. The door behind her hadn't opened yet. She pulled out her phone, opened the camera, held it at the edge of the boiler unit so it extended past the corner without her head extending past the corner, and watched the screen. The door was visible from this angle. She waited. 12 seconds. The door opened. The man who came through was not the gray jacket from outside. He was the watcher, the one she'd identified from the partition glass, the one who'd been covering the exits from inside the waiting room. He came through the door with his hand inside his jacket and his eyes moving, and he stopped when the room presented itself as large and full of machinery and shadow. He was looking for her. She was 8 feet to his right, behind the boiler unit, watching him on her camera screen, and he had no idea. He moved left. She moved right, slowly, staying behind the unit, maintaining the separation. He moved further into the room and she moved toward the door, and she was through it before he had completed his sweep of the left side. She let the door close quietly. Back into the corridor, moving faster now, through to the east stairwell, up 1 floor, and out into the radiology wing, which was quiet at this hour. Night shift skeleton coverage. 1 tech at the desk, who looked up at her with mild curiosity and said nothing because nurses moved through radiology at all hours, and there was nothing unusual about it. She walked through radiology, out the far door, into the main East Wing corridor. Pruitt was at the end of it. The detective was flanked by two uniformed officers, and she had the look of someone who had been receiving updates in real time and had arrived at the only floor where the updates made sense. And when she saw Mara, she exhaled a breath that said she had spent the last 6 minutes more tense than her voice had let on. "You were supposed to stay in the stairwell," she said. "One of them came in from the second floor," Mara said. "I had to move." "Where is he?" "Boiler room, ground floor, east side of the building. He came in through the loading corridor." She paused. "He had his hand in his jacket. I didn't wait to confirm." One of the uniformed officers was already on his radio. Pruitt looked at Mara with the expression she'd been using for days. The one that said the folder she'd built in her head about Mara Voss kept getting new pages added, and she wasn't sure how thick it was going to get. "The one from outside?" Pruitt said. "He went to the parking structure. Your unit should have him." Pruitt's radio confirmed it. 30 seconds later, one in custody, north parking structure stairwell, no incident. The second took 11 minutes. They found him in the boiler room exactly where Mara had said, which seemed to surprise no one except possibly the man himself, who had apparently convinced himself that he was the one doing the finding. Oh. They brought her into a conference room on the third floor, one of the administrative ones, with a long table and a whiteboard, and a window that looked out over the north parking lot where she could, if she positioned herself correctly, see the blue and red strobes of the unit that had taken the first man into custody. Pruitt sat across from her. One of the uniforms stood by the door. They had ID'd the two men within 30 minutes through prints. The one from outside, with gray jacket, was a man named Ferris Bowl. No local record. Out-of-state license. The watcher was a man named Dagan Cray, with 2 prior arrests in a city 400 miles away, both for charges that had been reduced and then dismissed in ways that suggested someone with money and patience had been managing his legal situation. "Solis called someone named Willard Pren," Pruitt said. "She said it the way you say a name when you've been looking at it long enough that it has started to feel less like a name and more like a problem. Pren is, we know him. We've known him for 3 years. He runs a network of protection operations across 6 cities. Solis is a mid-level operator, one of Pren's people. When Solis got picked up Tuesday, the call he made was to Pren's personal line." Mara looked at her. "And Pren sent these two?" "Within 48 hours, yes." Pruitt folded her hands on the table. "Here's what I need you to understand. This isn't about the diner anymore. What happened at Pharaoh's cracked something open. The footage went viral, which means Solis's name is attached to a story that now has 100,000 people following it. Pren doesn't operate well in the light. His whole structure depends on nobody looking." "And now everybody's looking," Mara said. "And now everybody's looking," Pruitt said. "Which makes you a liability he wants removed," Mara said, "or at minimum, discredited." Pruitt nodded. "We can hold Bowl and Cray on the false credentials and the trespassing. It gives us 72 hours. After that, unless we can connect them directly to Pren, we're looking at misdemeanor charges that won't hold them." Mara looked at the window. The strobes had stopped. "What are you asking me?" she said. Pruitt was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm asking you to tell me who you actually are. Because what happened tonight, the way you moved through this building, the choices you made, the way you managed 2 people who were actively trying to locate you, that's not trauma medic. That's not 8 years of Army Medical Corps." She paused. "That's something else." The conference room was quiet. Somewhere above them, the ventilation system ran its usual white noise, the same in every institutional building, the sound that said the building was alive and indifferent. Mara looked at the table. She had been careful for so long. The distance between what she said and what she didn't had seemed, for 4 years, like a reasonable way to live. Not deceptive, not dishonest, just selective. She had wanted the nurse. She had wanted the quiet and the routine and the particular satisfaction of work that mattered without the rest of it mattering too. But the rest of it had shown up anyway. It had followed the footage and the phone call and the 2 men in the parking structure, and it was sitting in this conference room with her whether she invited it or not. "I wasn't just a trauma medic," she said. Pruitt waited. "I was attached to a unit, a combat search and rescue unit, 66th CSAR, classified operations in 2 theaters. My medical training was the cover designation. What I was actually doing for the last 4 years of my service was, she stopped. We went into denied areas, hostile territory. We recovered personnel when other options were gone. Sometimes that meant medical, sometimes it meant other things. Pruitt was not writing, she was listening. I was there for a specific function, Mara continued. My team leader used to say I was the one they sent in when the situation was already broken and they needed someone who could work in the pieces. She paused. I was good at it. That was the problem. What do you mean, the problem? I mean, I was very good at it, and that meant they used me for a long time in situations that… She stopped again, restarted. When I came out, I needed something that was the opposite, something where the point was to fix people, not to navigate around them. The nursing made sense. Hargrove made sense. Being nobody in particular, in a building where all that mattered was whether you could do the job, that made sense. Pruitt looked at her for a long time. Your service record, she said. Is it accessible? Parts of it. Which parts aren't? The parts that would explain what happened in the boiler room, Mara said. Another long quiet. Then Pruitt said something unexpected. She said, We have a problem bigger than Bowl and Cray. She opened her tablet and turned it around. It was a message, internal, from a department address Mara didn't recognize. The body of the message was brief. Voss, Hargrove Memorial. Director Pennick has been contacted by Hargrove Group Legal regarding liability exposure from the Tuesday incident. Pending internal review, subject may be placed on administrative leave. Request coordination with HR notification. Mara read it twice. When? She said. The message came in an hour ago, Pruitt said, before Bowl and Cray showed up. Pennick may not even know about tonight yet. Mara set the tablet down on the table. She looked at the window. The north lot was dark again, the strobe lights gone, just the ordinary pale wash of the lot lamps across wet asphalt. Administrative leave. The particular bloodless language of institutional management, which had its own grammar, liability exposure, pending review, notification, and which meant, in plain terms, that Hargrove Memorial had calculated the cost of her and decided the math was unfavorable. She thought about the scaffolding case, the teenager, the compressions on the linoleum floor. She thought about Pennick looking at her file that morning and asking if anyone had ever asked, in 4 years, about the Army. They hadn't. Because nobody needed to know, and knowing didn't help anyone. And the work was the same regardless of what was in the parts of her record that weren't accessible. But now someone needed to know, and the knowing was about to cost her the one thing she had built that worked. There's something else, Pruitt said. Mara looked at her. When I ran your name through our systems, routine verification, nothing unusual about the process, I got a flag. Pruitt said it carefully. Not a law enforcement flag. A different kind. The kind that comes with a contact number and an instruction to notify before proceeding. The ventilation ran its white noise. I called the number, Pruitt said, 40 minutes ago, while my units were still working the building. Mara was very still. The person I spoke to, Pruitt said, asked me several questions about the situation. They were very specific questions, the kind of questions that implied they already knew most of the answers. She paused. They told me someone was coming, from outside the city. They said to tell you they got there as fast as they could. The conference room door opened. Not the uniform who had been standing by it. He had stepped aside, which meant whoever had opened the door had shown him something that made stepping aside the correct response. The man who came through was in his mid-50s, in civilian clothes that had the functional cut of a person who wore civilian clothes as a practical compromise rather than a preference. Silver at his temples. A scar at the jaw that had healed well a long time ago. He was carrying a brown folder under one arm, and he looked at Mara with the expression of someone who had been expecting this moment long enough that the moment itself was almost anticlimactic. She knew him. She had known him in a different country, in a different set of clothes, in a context that did not have conference rooms or whiteboards or parking lot lights through windows. She had known him in the kind of dark that cities didn't produce. Voss, he said. It was the first time in 4 years that anyone had used just her last name in just that way. The particular register of people who had been through things together that neither of them was ever going to fully explain. Callum, she said. He sat down. He put the folder on the table between them.
He looked at Pruitt and said, "I need 10 minutes with her, detective. Then I'll answer every question you have. But 10 minutes first." Pruitt looked at Mara.
Mara gave her the small nod that said it's all right, which wasn't entirely accurate but was the closest available truth, and Pruitt stood, and the uniform held the door, and then they were alone. Callum opened the folder. The first page was a photograph, aerial, the kind that came from assets she had spent years not asking the names of. A building, warehouse configuration, industrial outskirts of a city she didn't immediately recognize. Pren's primary operation, Callum said, not Calvert City, 300 miles southeast. She looked at the photograph. We've been watching him for 14 months, Callum said. Federal level, coordinated across 4 jurisdictions. The Calvert City operation was a piece of a larger structure. Solis was the node that connected the mid-level street operations to Pren's financial infrastructure. And I cracked it open, Mara said. You cracked it open, Callum said. The footage, the arrest, the public attention. Pren panicked and moved assets. And when he moved assets, he made contact through channels we'd been watching and hadn't been able to activate. He paused. You gave us 6 months of movement in 4 days. Mara looked at the photograph. The warehouse. The city she didn't recognize. I wasn't trying to give you anything, she said. I know. He turned to the second page. But here's the problem. Pren knows who you are now, not the nurse at Hargrove. The other thing. He looked at her. Someone ran your flag, not Pruitt, before Pruitt. Someone in Pren's organization has access to federal databases they shouldn't have access to, and they ran your flag 36 hours ago. The ventilation, the white noise. They know, she said. They know enough, Callum said. They know you're not just a nurse. They don't know the specific unit or the specific operations, but they know you were classified, and they know the flag exists, and they know that whatever you are, you're more of a problem than they initially calculated. She looked at the window. And Pennock wants to put me on administrative leave, she said. Callum looked at her with the expression of a man who had not expected that to be the sentence she led with, and who was recalibrating accordingly. Mara, he said. And then he said nothing for a moment because there was something in her face that needed a moment of space. The leave is the least of your problems. I know that, she said, but it's the one that... She stopped. He waited. I built something here, she said. That's all. I built something that works, and I don't want to lose it because Garrett Solis decided to shake down a diner on a Tuesday. Callum looked at her. He had known her in a different country, in a different context, and he knew what it cost her to say that, which was why he didn't say anything for a few seconds. Then he said, That's actually why I'm here. He turned to the third page of the folder. It was a memo. Department of Defense letterhead. Her name at the top. And below that, a set of words that she had not expected to see in a conference room in Hargrove Memorial Hospital at 9:42 on a Friday night, and which she read twice to make sure she was reading them correctly, and which, when she looked up, had changed the temperature of the room in a way that she didn't have a name for yet. This came through 2 hours ago, Callum said, before Pruitt called me, before Bowl and Cray, before any of tonight. He looked at her steadily. Someone higher than both of us decided that what happened at Pharaoh's Diner on Tuesday night was not an isolated incident, and that the woman who made it happen was not just a nurse. Mara looked at the memo. At the bottom, below the language she was still processing, was a signature she recognized, and below the signature, a single line that said, in the flat declarative style of official communication that had no interest in softening anything, reinstatement of active federal status, pending field assessment, authorization effective immediately upon subject's consent. She set the page down. She looked at Callum. Outside in the corridor, she could hear Pruitt's voice, quiet, patient, waiting. What does the field assessment involve? Mara said. Callum looked at her with something that was almost, in the particular light of the conference room, something like relief. Pren has a scheduled operation in 72 hours, he said. We know the location and we know the target. What we don't have is someone who can get inside the perimeter without triggering his security protocol. He paused. His team has medical staff on site. It's a front. They use a civilian medical presence as cover for the financial transfers. If someone could go in as medical support, as a nurse, Mara said. As a nurse, Callum said. She looked at the memo, at the signature, at the single line that was waiting for her to decide something. She thought about Dov Resnick behind the counter with his flat hands and 2 years of patience. She thought about the teenager in the observation bay and the man on the scaffolding and the compressions on the linoleum floor. She thought about the 14-hour ache in her feet and the soup that had gone cold. She thought about this version of herself that had walked into Pharaoh's diner just wanting 10 minutes of quiet, and the version that had walked out of it, and the distance between them that was not, it turned out, as large as she had spent 4 years believing. "Tell me the perimeter layout," she said. Callum spread the folder open to a hand-drawn schematic. Not digital, not printed, the kind that got made when you didn't want a record in any system that could be subpoenaed or hacked or pulled by someone who had access to federal databases they shouldn't have. The warehouse was a converted cold storage facility 312 miles southeast of Calvert City in an industrial corridor outside a mid-sized river city called Drenthe. Single access road. 2 exterior guards on rotating 4-hour shifts, loading dock on the south face, a secondary entrance on the east side that the schematic labeled medical, which was the point. Pren runs the medical cover through a staffing agency he controls, Callum said. They rotate personnel every 72 hours, so nobody on site long enough to see the full picture. The transfer is scheduled for Saturday night. Financial documentation, digital assets, physical materials we haven't fully characterized. When the operation runs, there are typically 4 to 6 Pren associates inside, plus the medical staff. He tapped the east entrance. You'd go in as a replacement shift. One of his regular medical contractors had a car accident yesterday. Convenient, Mara said. We arranged it, Callum said. Nobody was hurt. She's at home with a sprained wrist and a story about black ice. She doesn't know what her employer actually does. Mara looked at the schematic. The east entrance. The interior layout. A main floor. A mezzanine level with an office. A lower level, the schematic marked only as storage, restricted. What's my actual objective? You go in, you establish presence, you place 2 items. He slid a small case across the table, aluminum, the size of a glasses case. Passive transmitters, 1 on the mezzanine, 1 on the lower level. Once they're active, our technical team can pull the financial data off Pren's local servers remotely. The transmitters don't transmit until they're triggered by a signal from outside. 30-second window, then they go dark. And if someone finds them before the window, then we lose the data and you leave immediately. He paused. There's an extraction protocol built in. You won't be alone on the outside. Mara looked at the case. She did not pick it up. Who knows about this besides you and Pruitt, she said. 3 people at the federal level. The operation is compartmented. Pren has at least 1 contact with access to law enforcement databases. We don't know how high that goes, which is why nothing about Saturday is in writing above the level of people in this room. She thought about that for a moment. Someone with federal database access. The flag on her file pulled 36 hours ago by a source that wasn't Pruitt. He knew I had a flag before he sent Bowl and Cray, she said. Yes. Which means he pulled my record, saw the classification markers, and decided I was a threat worth removing rather than just a nurse who got lucky. That's our read. So his source is still active, Mara said. He can still pull records. Callum looked at her. He did not say yes again, because she was right, and they both knew it, and repeating it didn't improve the situation. She looked at the schematic for another 30 seconds. The east entrance. The mezzanine. The restricted lower level. She picked up the aluminum case. Pruitt came back in at the 10-minute mark, exactly, which told Mara something about the detective's relationship with stated timeframes. Callum gave her the version of the operation that she was cleared to receive, which was most of it. The federal case, the Pren network, the Saturday transfer. He left out the specific technical objective and the compartmentation concern, which were the parts that required her to simply trust that the people managing the information knew what they were doing, and Mara noticed that Pruitt noticed the omission and filed it without comment. What does this mean for Solis and his people locally? Pruitt said. They stay in custody through Saturday, Callum said. After the operation, you'll have everything you need to hold them on charges that stick. We'll coordinate with your DA directly. And Bowl and Cray. Same. Saturday night, you get the full picture. Pruitt looked at Mara. And you? She'll be back Sunday, Callum said. Mara did not correct him, because that was probably true, and also because the small uncertainty in it was the honest version. Pruitt looked at her for a moment longer. The look of someone who understood that the room had just made a decision and that the decision had been made without her full participation, and who had enough professional experience to recognize when that was the right call and when it wasn't, and was still working out which this was. "If anything goes sideways," Pruitt said, "you call me." "You'll be out of jurisdiction," Mara said. "I know," Pruitt said. "Call me anyway." Odd. She had 12 hours before she needed to be on the road. She drove home through the rain. It had started again, the same thin, determined rain from the week before. And she went into her apartment and stood in the center of it for a moment, in the way that she sometimes did when she came back from long shifts, just adjusting to the scale of it. It was a small apartment, clean, not decorated. A bed, a couch, a kitchen she used more than it looked like she used it, a shelf of books that were mostly technical, and one section that wasn't, which she kept facing inward out of a habit she'd never examined. She packed a bag, not a large one. She had learned a long time ago that the size of the bag was inversely proportional to how quickly you might need to move. She slept for 4 hours. Not well, but enough. In the morning, she drove south. Drenthe was the kind of river city that had been something specific once, manufacturing, probably, or shipping, and was now in the process of becoming something else without having fully decided what. The industrial corridor on its eastern edge was a stretch of converted warehouses and storage facilities and one active cold processing plant whose smell you could detect from half a mile away if the wind was coming from the east. She met Callum's technical team in the parking lot of a hardware store 4 miles from the target facility. 3 people, 2 men and a woman, in a panel van with the logo of a building maintenance company on the side. They gave her a new ID in the name of the contractor she was replacing, a set of scrubs from the staffing agency's standard issue, and a rundown of the personnel she'd encounter inside. "Primary contact will be a man named Joss Fetter," the woman said. Her name was Rhea, and she had the focused, unhurried manner of someone who had briefed people going into places before. "He manages the on-site logistics for Pren's operations. Mid-50s, runs the floor. He's not your threat. The threat is the man on the mezzanine." "Name?" "We don't have a name. He shows up on our surveillance as a rotating security supervisor. Different face each operation, which means Pren cycles his oversight deliberately. Whatever happens on the mezzanine is what Pren doesn't want his own floor people to see." Mara looked at the building schematic, the same hand-drawn one from the folder. "Camera coverage on the lower level?" "One camera at the stairwell door. It's on a closed system, not networked, which is why we need the transmitters placed physically." She looked at the aluminum case in her jacket pocket, smaller than a deck of cards, the kind of weight you could forget about. "Duration of cover," she said, 3 hours. "The shift runs from 9 to midnight. Transfer operation begins at 10:30. Rhea paused. "You don't need to be there when it runs. Get the transmitters in place and leave by 10. Mara nodded. She drove to the facility in the staffing agency's car, which Callum's team had sourced from the actual agency's lot. The keys duplicated, the car back in its space before anyone noticed. The east entrance was exactly where the schematic said it was. A single metal door set into the warehouse wall, a camera above it, an intercom panel. She pressed the buzzer at 8:53. A voice that sounded like it was doing 3 things at once told her to wait. 40 seconds later, the door opened. Joss Fetter was exactly as described. Mid-50s, functional in the way that people who manage logistics become functional, with a clipboard and a lanyard, and the slightly harassed expression of someone for whom this rotation was just another night of moving parts. "Lissette's replacement?" he said. "Mara Selden," she said, giving the contractor's first name and her own last name, which was the kind of small deviation that grounded a cover story in something real without putting your actual ID at risk. "Fine." He looked at her bag. "Medical kit stays in the supply room. You won't need most of it. There's a first aid station by the south loading dock if something comes up." "What usually comes up?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "That's the point." He walked her through the ground floor. It was large, the way warehouse spaces were. High ceiling, concrete floor, industrial shelving units along the walls. 3 large tables in the center with equipment she identified as financial processing hardware. Encryption devices. Data transfer units. 2 server towers. 4 men working at or near the tables, none of them looking up. The air smelled like cold concrete and the specific dry heat of electronics running continuously. The mezzanine was a steel structure at the north end, stairs up the right side, a railed walkway, a closed office with a frosted window. No one visible on the mezzanine from the floor level. The stairwell to the lower level was at the far south end, past the loading dock equipment. A camera above the door, as Rhea had described. Fetter showed her the supply room, left her there, and went back to his clipboard. She spent 12 minutes in the supply room familiarizing herself with its contents, which served two purposes. It was exactly what a new contractor would do, and it gave her time to identify the camera angle covering the supply room door, which left a blind spot in the southeast corner that she noted and did not immediately use. At 9:22, she walked to the first aid station by the loading dock. She stopped there, checked the kit, replaced two items that were past their expiration from the supplies she'd brought, because that was a thing medical staff did, and doing it was cover needed maintenance. While she was there, she noted the camera above the stairwell door. Its position, its angle, the degree of its horizontal sweep. The camera swept left to right on a 6-second cycle. At the rightmost point of the sweep, there was a window of approximately 2 seconds when the stairwell door itself was out of frame. She counted 3 cycles. Then she walked to the door, timed the sweep, and went through. The lower level was colder than the floor above. The sound changed. The hum of the equipment upstairs became a low, filtered drone. The space was smaller than the schematic had suggested, narrower, with shelving units on both sides and a long central aisle leading to a room at the far end behind a roll-up metal door, currently closed. The server infrastructure was visible from the aisle, not the main servers upstairs, a secondary array, mounted in a rack unit about halfway down on the right. Old equipment, but running. Status lights blinking green. She placed the first transmitter behind the rack unit, pressed until she heard the click of the magnetic mount engaging, and moved back toward the stairs. 11 minutes on the lower level. She had not been seen. Back through the camera window, back up the stairs. Back to the first aid station where she finished restocking the kit with the same pace she'd started with. At 9:48, a man came down from the mezzanine. She saw him from across the floor, tall, unhurried, with the specific kind of stillness that said he was paying attention to everything while appearing to pay attention to nothing. He walked the perimeter of the work tables, looked at the server towers, said something to one of the men at the nearest table. The man at the table nodded. Then he looked up. Not at her. At the mezzanine level, as if checking something on the underside of the walkway structure. Then he looked at her. She was already moving. Not away, toward him. Direct. Because hesitation was visible and directness was cover, and she had one role to play, and playing it meant playing it all the way. "Is there a water source down here?" she said. "I'm setting up a hydration check for the shift." He looked at her for a moment. The same fast, measuring look that people who watched rooms professionally developed, the look she had recognized in Bowl and Cray, and had no interest in replicating but knew well enough to detect. "Break room," he said. "North side, behind the stairs." "Thank you," she said. She went to the break room. There was a water cooler, a folding table, 4 chairs, a microwave. She filled 2 paper cups, set them on the table as evidence of her stated purpose, and stood there for a moment. The mezzanine office door was closed. The frosted window was lit from inside. She needed to be on the mezzanine. The schematic's second transmitter location was the mezzanine level, specifically the exterior wall behind the office, where the server connection ran through to the main financial processing hardware below. Without that transmitter, the technical team could only pull partial data. The ground floor transfer logs, not the mezzanine records, which were where, according to Callum, the actual evidence of Pren's network coordination was stored. She had 20 minutes before the 10 o'clock window she'd been given to exit. She went back to the floor. The man from the mezzanine was standing near the south loading dock now, talking on a phone. His back was mostly to her. She moved to the right side of the mezzanine stairs and walked up. The stairs were metal and her steps were not entirely silent, but the equipment hum covered the worst of it, and she moved with the deliberate pace of someone who had a reason to be where they were going. On the mezzanine walkway, the floor below was visible through the railing slats. She could see the tops of the server towers, the work tables, Fetter moving between them with his clipboard. The office door was closed. She moved along the wall toward the office, located the conduit run that Rhea had described. A cable tray bracket, mounted at shoulder height, running horizontally along the exterior wall behind the office. She placed the second transmitter in the bracket's back channel, pressed until she felt the magnetic click, and withdrew her hand. Done. She turned to go back to the stairs. The office door opened. The man who came out was not the security supervisor from the floor. He was smaller, older, wearing a plain dark sweater, with the kind of face that had stopped being memorable on purpose. He carried nothing in his hands. He looked at Mara with mild interest, the way you look at someone who has appeared in a space you didn't expect them to appear in. "Who are you?" he said. Not aggressive, curious. "Medical staff?" she said. "I was checking the—" She looked at the conduit tray. "The cable housing? We had a condensation issue at the last site. The humid air was affecting the monitoring equipment. It's a protocol check." He looked at the cable tray. He looked at her. "Which agency?" he said. "Harlow Medical Staffing," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Lissette's replacement," she said. He looked at her for another 2 seconds. "Right," he said. Then he went back into the office and closed the door. She walked back to the mezzanine stairs, down to the floor, across to the supply room. She checked her watch. 9:54. She had 6 minutes. She put on her jacket. She picked up her bag. She walked to the east entrance, pressed the exit bar, and stepped out into the cold parking area. Callum's team activated the transmitters at 10:01. She was already in the car. The drive back was 312 miles of highway in the dark, the rain having finally stopped somewhere south of the city so that the road surface was just wet rather than active, the kind of driving that put you in a specific kind of solitary focus. She stopped once for gas and coffee, stood outside the station in the cold for 3 minutes doing nothing, then got back in and drove. At 2:17 in the morning, her phone rang. "It's Rhea," the voice said. The pull was clean. Both transmitters held the window. "We have full transfer logs from the lower level and complete coordination records from the mezzanine." A pause. "Callum says to tell you it's enough." "It's enough for what?" Mara said. "For all of it," Rhea said. "All 6 cities." Mara drove. She got back to Calvert City at 4 in the morning and slept until 9. At 9:42 on Sunday morning, her phone showed 3 missed calls from Pruitt, a voicemail from Callum, and a text from a Hargrove Memorial number she recognized as Theo Birkins. She listened to the voicemail first. Callum's voice was briefer than usual, which with Callum meant either things had gone well or badly, and his tone was the version that meant well. "Federal warrants executed at 6 a.m. Pren in custody. Drenthe facility secured. Your part is done. Stand by for coordination from Pruitt." She called Pruitt. "Where are you?" Pruitt said. "My apartment." "Good. Stay there for an hour. I'm coming to you." "What happened?" "A lot," Pruitt said. "All at once. The federal execution kicked off what we needed locally. Solis is looking at federal charges now in addition to the local case. His lawyer has already called the DA's office twice this morning." A pause. "There's something else. The source inside the federal database. The person who pulled your flag for Pren's people." Mara waited. "We know who it is," Pruitt said. "And so does Callum. And the name is—" Her voice changed slightly. The way a voice changes when information is not just significant, but structural. When it rewrites the shape of other things. "The name is someone you know." "Tell me," Mara said. Pruitt was quiet for 3 seconds. "Evelyn Pennick," she said, Director of Nursing Services at Hargrove Memorial. Her sister has been in Pren's financial network for 9 years. Pennick's been running lookups for Pren's people as a favor. Access for access, protection for protection. She didn't know what most of them were for. A pause. "Until yours." The apartment. The small, clean apartment. The shelf of books facing inward. "She knew what mine was for," Mara said. "The memo about your administrative leave," Pruitt said. "We think it was Pren's suggestion. Pruitt wanted you removed from the hospital before Bowl and Cray arrived. She was going to give him a clear field." Mara sat with that. She thought about Saturday morning, Pennick looking at her file, asking about the Army, the particular quality of interest in her voice. Nobody asked. The way she had said it and the way Pennick had received it. Not curiosity, confirmation. "She told him who I was," Mara said. "As much as she could read from the file," Pruitt said. "Yes." The room was very quiet. "I'll be there in an hour," Pruitt said. The call ended. Mara set the phone on the table and looked at the window. Sunday morning light. Thin, clear, the first real light in a week that wasn't filtered through rain clouds. It came through the glass at a low angle and put a stripe across the table and across the back of her hand where it rested next to the phone. She thought about Pennick's office, the organized desk, the framed photograph always face down, the kind of private sadness or private loyalty that made a person keep something they couldn't display. She thought about what it cost to protect someone you couldn't talk about for 9 years, in the specific way that it cost, the accumulated weight of it, the way it bent decisions, the way it made you look at someone like Mara Voss with an expression she'd read as professional concern and had actually been something closer to calculation. She was not particularly surprised. She had been in rooms over the years where people had betrayed other people for reasons that were comprehensible even when they were not forgivable. Love was one of the most comprehensible. It was also one of the most destructive when it was aimed wrong. She picked up Burkhan's text. Hospital's been quiet. Thought you should know. Pennick didn't come in this morning. Administration hasn't said anything yet. People are noticing. She put the phone down. At 10:15, someone knocked on her apartment door. She wasn't expecting Pruitt for another 45 minutes, and Callum didn't knock. Callum sent a message first because he had the operational habit of never appearing at a location without confirming the location was clear. She went to the door and looked through the peephole. A man in a suit, mid-40s. The suit was federal, not in any obvious way but in the cut and the specific lack of anything personal about it. He was holding a credential wallet in his left hand, visible, which was deliberate. Behind him, in the corridor, she could see the edge of a second person. She opened the door. "Ms. Voss," the man said. "I'm Special Agent Darren Holt, Internal Affairs Division, Federal Bureau of Investigation. I'm sorry to come on a Sunday." He held up the credential. "We have some questions about Willard Pren's network, specifically about a set of operations that predate this week by a significant margin." Mara looked at him. She looked at the credential. She looked at the second person, who came into view, a woman, roughly the same age, the same federal cut suit. "How far back?" Mara said. Holt looked at her steadily. "We'd like to start with 14 months ago," he said, "when the surveillance operation on Pren began, and specifically who authorized the initial flag on your federal file." He paused. "Because the authorization on record doesn't belong to anyone currently working in an active capacity. And the person whose code is attached to it, the agent who formally flagged your file and set the notification protocol that brought Mr. Callum here on Friday night." He stopped. "What about them?" Mara said. "They died 8 months ago," Holt said, "which means someone has been using a dead agent's authorization codes to run active operations. And the operation that brought you back into the field was built on a foundation that we have reason to believe was not what it appeared to be." The Sunday morning light on the table, the stripe across the back of her hand. Mara looked at Holt. She looked at the credential. She looked back at him. "You'd better come in," she said. She stepped back from the door and let them in. Holt took the chair at the table without being invited, which was a choice that told her something about how he operated. Not rude exactly, just efficient in the way that people become efficient when they have spent years in rooms where the social niceties were a delay they couldn't afford. His partner, who introduced herself as Agent Sarah Vollman, stayed standing near the window, and that was also a choice. And Mara noted both choices and said nothing about either of them. She made coffee because the apartment had coffee, and because doing something with her hands while she thought was not a weakness. It was just honest. And she brought 2 cups to the table and kept one for herself and sat across from Holt and waited. "The agent whose codes were used," she said. "Name?" "Warren Tisch," Holt said. "I was a senior operations coordinator at the federal level, multi-jurisdictional case management, the kind of role that carries broad authorization. He died in March. Cardiac event, nothing suspicious. His codes should have been deactivated within 48 hours of his death." He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "They weren't." "Someone kept them active," Mara said. "Someone with administrative access to the deactivation system," Vollman said from the window. "Which is a short list." "How short?" 11 people, Holt said. "We've been working through the list since Friday. As of this morning, we're down to 3. Mara thought about Callum, the brown folder, the hand-drawn schematic, the way he had arrived in the conference room at Hargrove Memorial with a credential wallet and a document that had a dead man's authorization structure embedded in it, because that was what authorization effective immediately actually meant when you traced it back through the system. She had trusted Callum because she had known him in a different country, in conditions that built a specific kind of trust, the kind forged under pressure, where the alternative to trusting someone was dying next to them. That trust was real. She did not think it was misplaced. But trust and knowledge were not the same thing, and she had gone into a warehouse in Drenthe on the authority of a document she had not verified beyond recognizing the signature at the bottom, and the signature belonged to a man who might not have signed anything in 8 months. "Callum," she said. "Is he on the list?" Holt looked at her steadily. "No," he said. "He's not on the list. He also doesn't have administrative access to the deactivation system." A pause. "But someone used Tish's codes to build the operation that Callum was handed. He was given a case file, a target, and an authorization chain that looked clean because the codes looked clean. He didn't know Tish was dead." "You're sure?" "We've interviewed him this morning," Vollman said. "He came in voluntarily at 6:30. He was—" She paused, choosing a word. "Angry. In the specific way that people are angry when they've been used without knowing it." Mara thought about that. Callum at 6:30 on a Sunday, in an interview room, angry. That was accurate. That tracked. "So someone built a legitimate-looking federal operation," she said, using a dead agent's authorization codes, and pointed it at Pren's network. And the operation worked. You got Pren, you got the financial data, you got the coordination records. She looked at Holt. "Which means whoever built it wanted Pren taken down." "Yes," Holt said. "And they needed someone to go into the warehouse." "Yes." "Someone whose record had a flag on it, someone who could be activated through the flag." She set her coffee down. "Someone who was already in Pren's sightline because of what happened at Pharaoh's diner, which put them in danger, which meant the activation would feel necessary, urgent." Holt was quiet. "They built the threat," she said. "Bowl and Cray at the hospital. That was engineered, not by Pren, by whoever built the operation, to make sure I said yes." The Sunday light had moved while they'd been talking, the stripe across the table shifting a few degrees toward the window. Vollman was still at the window. Holt had his hands around the coffee cup. "We don't know that Bowley and Cray weren't sent by Pren," Holt said carefully. "Solis did make the call to Pren's line. That's verified. But Pren's people have been interviewed this morning as part of the federal execution. Pren's logistics coordinator says Pren was told about the diner incident and told about you, and his response was to have Solis's situation monitored and to wait. He didn't authorize Bowl and Cray." The room was very quiet. "Someone else sent them," Mara said, "to make sure I was scared enough to go into the warehouse." "That's what we're looking at," Holt said. She sat with that for a long moment. The particular feeling of having been moved, not manipulated exactly, because the outcome had been real and the warehouse operation had been necessary and Pren was in custody and the data was clean, but moved, positioned, used as a piece in someone else's operation without being told that was what she was. She had spent 8 years being a piece in operations. She had known that was what she was, and she had chosen it because the operations mattered, and the pieces that got moved through them were moved toward something. She had left that life because she wanted to stop being moved and start making her own decisions about where she stood. And then a Tuesday night at a diner had pulled her back into a geometry she hadn't chosen, run by someone she couldn't see, toward an outcome that was real but had been reached through a method that nobody had asked her about. The honest thing, the thing she sat with in the silence of her apartment while Holt waited, was that she wasn't sure how angry she was. She was something. She was the thing that came before anger, when you are still working out whether what happened to you was a harm or just a complication that felt like one. Pren was in custody. 6 cities' worth of protection operations were being rolled up this morning. Dov Resnick and every other business owner who had spent years paying for the privilege of being left alone were waking up to a Sunday that was different from the previous Sunday in a way they didn't know yet. She could be angry about the method. She could also look at what the method had produced. She did not resolve this in the silence. She set it aside. "What do you need from me?" she said. "Testimony," Holt said. "Formal statement about the warehouse operation. What you were told, by whom, in what sequence. We need to build the chain of custody for the data the transmitters pulled. If it comes out in federal proceedings that the operation was built on fraudulent authorization, the data could be challenged." "Could be," she said. "Defense attorneys are creative," Vollman said from the window. I'll give you the statement, Mara said. Everything I was told and everything I observed in sequence. You'll have it today. Holt nodded. He set down his cup. There's one more thing, he said, and his voice shifted slightly. Not into something softer exactly, but into a different register, the one people use when they are about to say something that they have thought carefully about. The operation that was built around you. Whoever built it chose you for a reason. Your specific skill set, your specific situation at Hargrove, your connection to the diner incident. They knew a great deal about you. They pulled my file, Mara said. More than your file, he said. They knew your patterns, your shift schedule, the fact that you eat at late-night diners after long shifts. He looked at her. We don't think this started with Pharaoh's. We think Pharaoh's was the spark, but the tinder had been arranged before that. The shelf of books facing inward. The apartment that was clean and not decorated. The 4 years she had spent being nobody in particular in a building where all that mattered was the work. You're saying someone has been watching me, she said. We're saying someone knew enough about you that when the opportunity presented itself, they were ready to build around it. Holt stood. We'll find out who. The authorization codes will lead us there. They always do, eventually. He picked up his credential wallet from the table. In the meantime, I'd ask you to be careful. I'm always careful, Mara said. I know, he said. Do it anyway. They left. The door closed. The apartment was quiet. She drank the rest of her coffee and thought about the shape of the week that had just happened to her. And then she picked up her phone and called Pruitt and told her to add 40 minutes to her ETA because there were 2 federal agents she needed to connect with first, and gave her Holt's number. Then she sat in the Sunday morning light and allowed herself for exactly 4 minutes to feel the full weight of all of it. The warehouse and the mezzanine and the man who'd come out of the office and the 4-hour drive back in the dark and the stripe of light on the table, and the fact that someone had been watching her, and the fact that she was still here to be watched. 4 minutes. Then she stood up and washed the coffee cups. Pruitt arrived at 11:10. She came alone, without the formal stance of a detective on duty, and sat at the kitchen table with the directness of someone who had been doing official things since 6 in the morning and had decided that this visit was going to be the honest version. Pennick was taken in for questioning at 8 a.m., she said. She didn't resist. She sat down and she answered every question clearly and completely, and the picture that emerged was... She stopped. She didn't know what she was doing. I mean that technically. She knew she was running lookups for her sister's associates. She didn't know what the network was, what the money was, what the people whose files she was pulling were being positioned for. Pruitt looked at her hands. Her sister has been in Pren's financial orbit since she got into debt 20 years ago and couldn't get out. Pennick's been running interference, small things, slow things, the kind of thing you do when you love someone, and the alternative is watching them go down. Mara thought about the photograph on Pennick's desk, always face down. Not sadness, not privacy. Evidence. And mine? She said. Yours she did on a direct request from a number she'd been given as an emergency contact. She was told it was a routine background check, a security clearance update. Pruitt looked up. When she realized what had actually happened, that Bowl and Cray had shown up at the hospital the same night, she went home and didn't come back. I don't think she knew Mara, not what she was helping with. That doesn't change what she did, Mara said. No, Pruitt said. It doesn't. They sat with that. What happens to her, Mara said. Cooperation agreement, most likely. Her testimony about the lookups and the contact structure helps build the network map. She'll lose her position. She may face charges that get reduced in exchange for the cooperation. She won't work in hospital administration again. Pruitt paused. The administrative leave memo. It's been formally rescinded as of this morning. HR issued a correction. You're on the record as having been on approved personal leave, not administrative. Mara looked at her. Someone at the hospital pushed back, Pruitt said. Filed an internal objection to the leave memo Friday night before any of this broke. Said the documentation was procedurally inadequate and that moving against a staff member without a formal review process was outside protocol. She looked almost amused, despite everything. Theo Burkan. Mara thought about Burkan in the corridor on Friday night with the particular expression of a man doing something outside his job description because the alternative was worse. Meticulous, she said. Apparently, Pruitt said. The formal statement took 3 hours. She gave it to Holt and Vollman in a conference room at the Federal Building downtown. The same kind of room as the one at Hargrove Memorial, the same beige walls, the same tissue box, as if the federal government had decided on one interior design solution for moments requiring honesty and deployed it universally. She was precise and sequential, and she did not editorialize. She gave them the warehouse, the schematic, the transmitter placements, the conversation with the man from the mezzanine office, the drive back, the call from Rhea. She gave them Callum's briefing in full. She gave them everything in the sequence it had happened because that was what the situation required. And because she had learned a long time ago that the cleaner the account, the fewer the places for a defense attorney to find purchase. When she was done, Holt thanked her and told her the statement was more complete than most he'd received from people with formal interview training. "I've given a lot of statements," she said. "I know," he said. "I've been reading them." She looked at him. "How many?" "Enough," he said, which was not an answer but was the honest version of not having an answer he was cleared to give. She went home. 3 days later, Willard Pren was arraigned in federal court. The charges were read aloud in a courtroom in Drenthe: organized extortion, conspiracy, witness intimidation, financial fraud across 6 jurisdictions, and 17 counts of specific conduct relating to named businesses and named individuals who had been paying for the privilege of being left alone for periods ranging from 8 months to 4 years. The courtroom was not packed, because these things rarely were, but it was attended by attorneys and federal representatives and 3 people from the DA's office in Calvert City, including Pruitt, who stood in the back and watched Willard Pren, who had never been in a room where he was not the person with the most control over what happened next, stand at a defendant's table and hear his own name attached to things he had carefully arranged to never be attached to in public. He was 56 years old. He was wearing a suit that had been expensive before it spent the weekend in federal custody. He stood very still and looked at the judge and said nothing except the legally required words, which he said in a voice that was flat and without effect. The bail figure set by the judge was one that his attorneys objected to, and the judge overruled the objection, and Willard Pren went back to the room he had been in since Saturday morning. Garrett Solis took a plea agreement 4 days after that. The agreement required his full cooperation with the federal case: names, structures, financial routes, the network of mid-level operators in all 6 cities. He gave all of it in exchange for a sentence reduction that still left him looking at 7 years. His attorney called it a good outcome. Solis, sitting across from the federal attorneys in an interview room, looked like a man who had recently had the experience of being the most powerful person he knew and had discovered, in the space of 10 days, how far that extended and where it stopped. Corso Wyatt, who had put his boot through her plate, received no such agreement. He had nothing to trade, and the local charges, assault, intimidation, participation in an organized extortion scheme, stacked neatly into a sentence that his public defender described in writing as unfavorable. Mara did not follow his case closely after that. She had enough information. Reuben Mass cooperated early and got a lesser charge. Mara thought about the way he had stood by the counter in Pharaoh's with his hands where they couldn't be seen, and she thought that a man who practiced concealment that reflexively had probably been looking for an exit from his situation for longer than anyone had been looking for him. The investigation into the unauthorized use of Warren Tisch's authorization codes continued. Holt sent her a brief message 2 weeks after the arraignment, 3 sentences professionally worded, telling her that the source had been identified and was facing internal federal charges that he was not at liberty to detail, but that she could expect her formal file to reflect a complete accounting. She read the message twice and replied with 4 words: "Thank you. Stay careful." She never found out who had arranged Boll and Cray, or whether they had genuinely been sent by Pren through a channel his logistics coordinator hadn't known about, or whether they had been part of the manufactured pressure. It remained an open edge, and she decided, after sitting with it for several days, that she was going to live with the open edge. Not because it didn't matter, but because the things that could be resolved had been resolved, and the things that couldn't were going to cost her more energy than they were worth. She had been making that calculation her whole adult life. It had not gotten easier. She had just gotten more honest about what it cost. Dov Resnick reopened Pharaoh's on a Thursday, 3 weeks after the night it had all begun. He didn't make an announcement. He just put the sign back in the window. Open until 2 a.m., in the marker that had bled at the edges, and turned on the lights and started the soup. Mara found out from Pruitt, who had gone in for coffee, and texted her a photograph of the place from the inside. The booths, the counter, the low lights, the ordinary warmth of a space that had been a crime scene and was now a diner again. She went in on a Friday after a 12-hour shift. Dove was behind the counter. He looked up when she came in, and the expression that moved across his face was not uncomplicated. It was the expression of someone who had been thinking about a moment, and now the moment was here, and it had more texture than the thinking had prepared him for. "Soup's hot," he said. "Good," she said. She sat in the same booth. The plate was new. The booth had been cleaned, the linoleum repaired where the scraping of a moved table had left marks. The corner near the jukebox repainted. Not new, exactly. Restored, which was better. He brought the soup without being asked. Chicken, the same recipe, the same stock. He set down a piece of bread on a small side plate. "On the house," he said. "The whole thing, tonight." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," he said. "That's why I'm doing it." He looked at her. 2 years, he said. That's how long it was. "I know. I almost sold the place. Last spring, I almost just walked away." He was quiet for a moment. "My wife said don't. She said it was mine and I'd built it, and the only way to let them win was to leave before they made me." He looked at the room. "She was right. She's usually right, which she mentions." Mara looked at the soup. "How is she?" she said. "Worried," he said. "Less than before. Getting there." He set his hands on the counter. "You?" She thought about the honest answer. "Getting there," she said. He nodded. He went back to the counter. She ate the soup. It was still good. It was exactly as good as the first time, which was the particular achievement of someone who had made the same thing long enough that they'd found the irreducible version of it. Not perfect, not showy, just exactly what it was supposed to be. She ate all of it, and the bread, and she sat for a few minutes after with her coffee and the ambient sounds of the diner, which had people in it now. A few tables occupied, the countermen who might have been the same ones or might not. The ordinary low conversation of a place that was open because it had chosen to stay open. When she left, she pushed the full amount of the bill through the tip slot on the counter and walked out without discussing it. She went back to Hargrove Memorial on a Monday. The administration had formally processed her return from what the HR paperwork called approved leave, which was a bureaucratic fiction that served everyone's purposes. Her badge still worked. Her locker still had her things in it. The ER smelled exactly as it always had. Antiseptic and coffee and the underlying chemical human smell of a space where urgency was the baseline condition. Birkin was at the nursing station. He looked up when she came through the security door, and his expression did the thing it did. Precise, measured, and beneath the precision, slightly relieved in a way he would probably deny if asked. "You're scheduled for C floor today," he said. "Triage overflow. It's going to be a full day." "Is it usually not?" she said. "Fair point," he said. He handed her the shift folder. "Mara." She looked up. He was looking at her with the expression of a man who had one specific thing he wanted to say and was in the process of saying it as efficiently as possible. "What you did in this building last Friday, the way you moved, the decisions you made, I've worked here 11 years. I've seen nurses do remarkable things." He paused. "I've never seen anything like that." She looked at him. She thought about what to say and settled on the thing that was true. "You filed an objection to the leave memo," she said. "It was procedurally inadequate. That's not why you did it." He held her gaze for a moment. "No," he said. "It's not." He turned back to his station. "Go to work." She went to work. The formal federal recognition came 6 weeks later. It was not a ceremony. She had been specific about that with Callum, who had delivered the request to the relevant parties with the same directness she'd asked him to use, and the relevant parties had complied because they were in no position to insist on a ceremony for someone who had made it clear that the ceremony was a courtesy she was declining. What came instead was a letter, official letterhead, specific language, formally expunging the period of her service record that had been classified to the point of functional invisibility. The work she had done with the 66th CSAR and the additional work that fell outside that designation was now part of a coherent record that a person could read and understand, within the limits of what remained appropriately restricted. It also contained a formal commendation for the Drenthi operation. She read the letter twice at her kitchen table on a Wednesday morning before a shift, with coffee. She thought about what it meant that pieces of her that had been officially invisible for 8 years were now, not public, but acknowledged, in the record, accounted for. She had not known, until she read it, how much that mattered. She had told herself for 4 years that the invisibility was fine, that it was the choice she had made, trading recognition for quiet, trading the full account of what she'd done for the simpler version that fit inside a hospital and a set of scrubs and a 14-hour shift. She had believed that. She had made it work, mostly. But there was something about seeing it on paper. Not commendation, not ceremony, just the flat factual accounting of a record corrected, that landed differently than she had anticipated. Not pride, exactly. More like the specific relief of being correctly described after a long time of not being. She put the letter in her bag. She finished her coffee. She went to work. Pruitt called her on a Thursday evening, 2 months after Pharaoh's, when Mara was in her car in the hospital parking lot eating a sandwich because she had learned exactly nothing from the night that started all of this, and still could not make herself eat a full meal before an evening shift. Solis testified today, Pruitt said. Closed session, but the DA's office gave me a summary. A pause. He talked about you. What did he say? He said he knew, from the moment you didn't react when he sat down at your table, that the situation was going to be different than he expected. He said he'd never seen anyone sit that still when they were actually calm, and he'd spent 20 years being able to tell the difference. Another pause. He said he should have left. Mara looked at the parking lot, the sodium lamps, the rows of cars. A night nurse she recognized by sight was walking toward the entrance with her head down against the cold. He's right, she said. He should have. He also said, Pruitt continued, that he asked around about you afterward, before he made the call to Pren. He wanted to know who you were. And what he found was nothing. A nurse. 4 years at Hargrove, good evaluations, no record, no history that explained what she'd done in a diner on a Tuesday night. A pause. He said that scared him more than anything else. Not what you'd done. The nothing around it. Mara finished the last of the sandwich. The nothing was the point, she said. That's what I built. I know, Pruitt said. I just thought you should hear that it worked. She sat in the car for a moment after the call ended, in the sodium lamp light, and she thought about that. The nothing that scared him. The 4 years of careful, deliberate ordinariness built around a person who was not ordinary, not because she was exceptional in any way that had ever made her life easier, but because she had survived things that left marks you couldn't see unless you knew where to look. And she had taken those marks and built a life around them that was honest, even if it wasn't complete. The nothing had worked as cover. It had also, for 4 years, been a cage she'd built herself and called it shelter. She was not sure, sitting in the parking lot, that she could go back to that version entirely. The record had been corrected. Birkin had filed his objection. Dove had turned the lights back on. Pruitt had called from a city 400 miles away because she'd said, "Call me anyway." Things had happened. They had left marks. The marks were different this time. She got out of the car and went inside. In the weeks that followed, the hospital changed around her in small ways that were not small. The staff who had seen the news coverage, who had connected the footage and the name and the woman they worked alongside every day, did not treat her differently in the dramatic sense. Nobody applauded. Nobody made speeches. What happened was subtler, and she found more meaningful. The specific quality of attention people paid her shifted. Not deference. Not the performative respect that people extend to someone they've decided is remarkable. Something quieter. The kind of attention that says, I see you more clearly than I did, and what I see is not less but more. The new ER director, a man named Farley Dunn, who had come in after a restructuring that had nothing to do with Mara and everything to do with Hargrove Group's response to the institutional embarrassment of the Pennock situation, stopped her in the corridor during her second week back and said 3 sentences to her that she thought about for a long time afterward. I read your file when I took this position, he said. The whole thing, including the parts that are now accessible. I want you to know that this hospital has a policy on staff with specialized backgrounds. And the policy is that we're glad to have them, and we don't ask them to be less than they are. He paused. If you ever want to do anything beyond triage nursing, my door is open." She thanked him and did not commit to anything because she was not ready to commit to anything beyond showing up and doing the work, which was what she had been doing for 4 years and intended to keep doing for the foreseeable future. But she thought about the door being open. She thought about it more than she expected to. 6 weeks after the arraignment, she drove to Drenthi alone on a day off. Not to the warehouse, to the federal courthouse, where a preliminary hearing in the Pren case was open to the public, and where she sat in the back row of the gallery for 40 minutes and watched Willard Pren, who had spent 20 years being the person who decided how rooms felt, sit at a defendant's table and answer to a woman in a robe who was not impressed by him. She did not feel triumph sitting there. She had tried on the drive down to identify what she expected to feel, and triumph was the obvious answer, but it wasn't accurate. What she felt was closer to completion, the particular resolution of something that had been open and now was closing, not because of what she'd done in any single place, but because of the accumulated weight of what a lot of people had done together, most of them doing their specific job and doing it well. Pruitt with her 7-year case, Holt with his 3-sentence message, Birkin with his procedural objection, Dove with 2 years of patience that had not, in the end, broken him. She was part of that, one part among many. That seemed right to her. It seemed more accurate than the alternative, where she was the singular thing that had changed everything, which was the story that the footage told if you watched it in isolation and didn't know anything that came before or after. She drove back to Calvert City on the same highway she'd driven in the dark after the warehouse, and this time it was afternoon and the light came at a low November angle across the flat fields on either side of the road. And she drove at the speed limit and listened to the radio and stopped once for bad coffee at a gas station and drank it anyway because it was there. The thing about being underestimated, she had learned, not in a diner, not on Tuesday of that specific week, but across the full length of a life spent in rooms where people made fast decisions about who was worth paying attention to, was that it was never really about the person being underestimated. It was about the estimator's need to know, quickly and cheaply, how much of a threat any given person represented. Tired woman in scrubs, eating alone, late at night. The calculation was fast and it was wrong, and it had been wrong for the same reason most fast calculations were wrong. It used the visible information and none of the invisible, and the invisible was where most of what mattered lived. She did not blame Solis for the calculation. She did not have the energy or the interest. She had been underestimated in rooms far more consequential than Pharaoh's Diner by people with more information than Solis had, and every time it happened, it carried the same 2-part truth. The underestimation was their error, and surviving it was hers. What had changed, what the week had cracked open in her, along with everything else, was the question of what came after surviving. She had been answering that question for 4 years with the same answer: quiet, small, contained. Build something that works and protect it by keeping it invisible. But the invisible had costs she hadn't fully accounted for, the record being incomplete. The 4 years of letting people see the nurse and nothing else, which was a choice that worked until the moment it didn't, and then left her standing in a conference room trying to decide how much of herself she could afford to hand over. She was not interested in becoming the story. She was not interested in the footage or the coverage or the version of herself that lived in the caption of a viral clip. She had no appetite for any of that, and she was clear-eyed enough to know that she never would. But she was done with the version of quiet that required her to be less than she was just to avoid the friction of being fully seen. That version had served its purpose. It had helped her survive the transition out of a life that had used her hard, and it had given her 4 years of work that mattered, and a building she knew by heart, and colleagues she trusted in the specific, functional way that you trust people when the work is the thing that holds it together. She was keeping all of that. She was adding to it, not replacing it. The door that Dunn had said was open, she was going to walk through it eventually. Not because she had decided to become something different, but because what she already was had always been larger than the frame she'd been fitting it into, and the frame had finally broken, and there was no point in pretending it could be repaired. She took the exit for Calvert City and drove through the early dark toward the part of town where Pharaoh's Diner had its lights on and its sign in the window. And she did not stop because she had work in the morning, but she drove past slowly enough to see the ordinary warm light through the glass and the shadows of people inside eating dinner on a Thursday. and the sign that said open until 2 a.m. in marker that had bled at the edges. She drove home. She was by any reasonable account exactly where she had been 6 weeks ago. Same apartment, same job, same city, same feet that ached after long shifts in a way that 14-hour work could produce in anyone, regardless of what else they were. But something had been named that had not been named before. Something had been put into the record that had existed only in the unreadable dark. And the woman who had walked into a diner wanting 10 minutes of quiet and a bowl of soup that was better than it needed to be had, walked back out of the last 6 weeks carrying something that was harder to name than a commendation or a corrected file or a federal arrest. She was carrying the knowledge that the quiet she had built was real, that the work she had chosen was real, that the version of herself she had been, in the scrubs and the 14-hour shifts and the linoleum floor with her hands on a stranger's chest, was not a diminished version of something larger, but a complete version of someone who had decided that saving people, in whatever room they found her in, was the most honest use of what she was. She parked the car. She sat for a moment in the dark. The radiator was still making the sound she had been choosing to ignore. She was going to get it fixed. Tomorrow. She was going to make the call, schedule the appointment, take the car in. She had been letting it go for 3 months because the sound was intermittent and the car ran fine, and there was always something more urgent, and she had spent her life making that calculation about the things that weren't immediately broken. It was a small decision. It was also the kind of small decision that, made regularly and without drama, was the actual substance of a life. Not the warehouse, not the diner, not the federal courtroom, or the commendation or the footage with the 400,000 views. The appointment that you finally make. The door that someone says is open and that you actually walk through. She got out of the car. She went inside. The shelf of books was still facing inward. She turned them around.